Thank you. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm just going to take you through my presentation on online misogyny and young people. Before we get started, hello, my name is Ashley and I am Prevention Education and Community Engagement Practitioner at Shetland Women's Aid. So my day-to-day job is the prevention work in the Shetland Islands, going into schools and communities to work together to eradicate gender-based violence. I just want to make it clear that I am by no means an expert in online misogyny. This presentation was put together because of a need in our local community, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But I think having discussions with Samantha and the rest of the network, I mean, we're in Shetland, we're a very rural community, and if we are seeing issues here in Shetland, the chances are the rest of you around Scotland are too. So hopefully this presentation that I had developed for our local youth workers, teachers, anybody working with young people will be applicable to you as well. And it's just a note to say, please take care. Some of the stuff that we're talking about is a little bit uncomfortable or disturbing, so just please take a break at any moment. What to expect today? I should say as well that this presentation that I normally do would take around an hour and a half, 2 hours. So I am just going to whiz through it a little bit. But some of the stuff that we'll be covering is just an introduction to online misogyny, what that is, what that looks like, what we mean by the manosphere. We'll look at some key figures and things to pay attention to. And then perhaps most importantly for some of yourselves is how to recognise if there's any young people in your life that might be being affected by online misogyny, and then what we can do about it to start those kind of meaningful conversations for change. So first of all, what is online misogyny? Well, it is the hatred of, contempt for, or prejudice against women and girls amplified online via social media, online forums, apps, and websites. So just like any other form of gender-based violence, it is mainly perpetrated by men and is both a cause and consequence of women's inequality. And it is sort of due to the harmful stereotypes upheld in our communities. And we'll talk about that a bit more later. So first things first, an introduction to the manosphere. So some of you have probably heard this term before, maybe some of you haven't. So I'll just walk through some of the different elements of what is referred to as the manosphere. So it's a network of misogynistic online communities. Now, this is not necessarily an organized network, but this is like pockets of communities that we see online that kind of interconnect with each other, and they promote a very toxic version of masculinity that is in direct opposition to feminism. And these are some of the communities that I will walk you through briefly so that you have a general awareness. And then later on, we'll talk about what we can do to combat this manosphere. So as you can see, the sort of big one that most people will have heard of is incels. We've got PUAs, which is pickup artists. We've got MRAs, we've got MGTOW, we've got the red pill community, and then we've got the alt-right and white supremacy. So like I said, I will go through all of these. This is just a snapshot of what we mean by the manosphere. So I was first introduced to the manosphere through pickup artists. So pickup artists were particularly common in the early 2000s, and they are men who use manipulative techniques to seduce or control women. The main thing really for pickup artists is that they view women as sexual objects to conquer. And pickup artists, they use strategies to lower a woman's self-esteem and essentially control her for their own personal gain. Like I said, I first heard of these in the early 2000s. There was a book called The Game that was written by Neil Strauss, which was very popular. I think it was in 2005, and it sold thousands and thousands of copies worldwide. And it was essentially a manual in how to control and manipulate women. This man here, Mystery, he is one of the sort of founding fathers of this era of pickup artists. And what they did was they promoted tools such as negging and peacocking and ran sort of thousands of workshops in person as well as online around the world. So when we talk about negging, that is sort of deliberately lowering someone's self-esteem and putting them down. So it's essentially a backhanded compliment. So pickup artists would deliberately make a woman feel inferior, and their idea was that this would limit a woman's self-worth and would make it more likely that she would want to sleep with him. And peacocking, as you can see from Mystery here, is wearing often ridiculous items of clothing for attention. That was the early 2000s. So when things started moving more online by the mid 2000s, then the culture of pickup artists sort of evolved into what we now see as like dating coaches and relationship experts. So I will talk a little bit about him later, but obviously there's the likes of Andrew Tate, but there are other social media influencers that really, I suppose you would call these like online grifters, where they really target vulnerable young men who are feeling particularly lonely and feeling particularly isolated, and they are selling these package techniques on how to control and manipulate women. Like I said, these women to them are seen purely as targets, and it really is a case of avoiding all emotional attachment. This is a transaction, and it really comes from that idea that men are entitled to sex from women. So that is the first sort of element of the manosphere that some people might be aware of. Now, next up is incels. And that is, maybe if you're coming to this webinar, you're probably familiar with the term, but incels stand for involuntary celibate. So this is a really huge subculture online, people that define themselves as being unable to find a romantic or sexual partner despite desiring one. For what reason is debatable, but it's interesting that the term was first coined by a woman in 1997, but it has really been co-opted since then, and it's associated with men who feel that sense of entitlement to sex, but they're of the belief that the reason why women are rejecting them is due to superficial preferences. So there is a real hostility towards women, a real hatred of women, and also of like stereotypical masculine men, of a sort of a blame for their unhappiness. So there's a lot of resentment, a lot of hostility, and this is a worldwide community. This incel culture is something that's going to be throughout this presentation. Because although the online community is very prevalent online, as we've seen, it has led to high profile extremism such as mass killings, femicides, including actually in the UK some quite recent deaths. So it's not just an online problem, but it's very prevalent online. Again, I am conscious of the time, so I could talk about this for ages, but I will just move on, and we can come back to incel culture in a bit. But I just want to highlight, when we're talking about high profile cases that you might be aware of, these are two that would quite clearly spring to mind. Jake Davidson in Plymouth in 2021, he made videos that expressed his desire for his to get a girlfriend and his failure to have love and sex, and that resulted in a hatred towards women. And he did go out and attack people, kill people. And similarly with Elliot Rodgers, so this was back in 2018 in America. He essentially had this incel manifesto. So it says here, the incel, when he posted to Facebook before he committed mass killings, and he said, the incel rebellion has already begun. We will overthrow all the Chads and Stacys. All hail the supreme gentleman, Elliot Rodger. Chads and Stacys is terms that will come up and I'll talk about shortly. But it is just worth pointing out that there are real life consequences for these kinds of ideologies. Next, which is closely interlinked with incel subculture, is the idea of the red and black pill community. So if you're familiar with the Matrix, then you'll be familiar with the metaphor, but it's the idea that if you take the red pill, then you've been awakened to the reality and the truth of the world. And for people in the red pill community, then this is the reality that the world is rigged against them and is biased against men. So there's a huge distrust of women, and this subculture really portrays feminism as harmful to men and boys. So this idea that women's rights means men's rights are being taken away, and I will move on to rights in a second, and really promotes this idea of unattainable hypermasculinity and rigid gender norms. So this idea that men have to be super tall, they have to be super muscular, they have to be super confident, and that's just unobtainable. So, and this is all because society is rigged against them. So it really is a worldview that like it says here, it's deeply pessimistic. And the black pill community stems from the red pill community, taking it one step further, saying that like sexual success is impossible due to their genetics or appearance. So again, it really does all come back around to this idea that women are seen as objects and women are seen as valuable for sex only. And again, there's just a real hatred towards women, particularly women in feminist movements. And yeah, there's a radical skepticism for general society, really. So this can lead to other forms of radicalization that I'll talk about in a bit. But really, incel and the red pill community, they kind of go hand in hand. Not everybody in the red pill community would consider themselves involuntary celibate, but quite often these ideologies go hand in hand. And so when we're talking about the manosphere, again, we're talking about all of these different subcultures that are not insular. They're very much connected and overlap with each other. So that moves on to men's rights activists, which is a little bit different. So this is a branch of the men's liberation movement from the early 1970s. And actually, in the beginning, a lot of concerns raised by MRAs are completely valid. However, when we're talking about MRAs as a subculture of the manosphere, we're talking about a movement that really has been co-opted by anti-feminist rhetoric and really emphasizes this idea that women and feminism are the cause of men's struggles. So rather than actually focusing on men's rights and advocating for them, it really is just another space to promote misogyny. And saying that, there is a focus on things like fathers' parental rights, male victims of domestic abuse, men's mental health issues. Some of these issues are very real. However, and I'll talk about this a little bit when it comes to influencers, this is a very like clever group of people. So they use a certain rhetoric and they use certain facts and statistics that, particularly for young men and boys, it's very, very easy to believe without actually questioning whether these facts are true or not. And MRAs really argue that now feminism has gone too far and men are now the people suffering with inequality in our society. So again, MRAs, like all of these other subcultures, there's a huge victimhood narrative, and this real feeling of being unfairly treated in society. And like I said, yeah, here they use unverified data to prove systemic biases against women. So this is a very clever subculture. This is can be quite an academic seeming subculture. So this is one that actually, when it comes to talking about how young people are accessing these kind of online communities, it can come across as quite legitimate, and that is really concerning. Next up, we've got MGTOW, which stands for Men Going Their Own Way. That is their sort of symbol. So if you ever see that symbol, then that is what it means. And this is a sort of extreme subculture of the manosphere. So these are men who are choosing to just completely opt out of relationships with women, not just romantic or sexual relationships, but wherever possible, just avoiding women altogether. It's very much focusing on self-preservation and independence, and this idea that women are not used for anything, they cause more harm than good, it's not worth the hassle, so we'll just remove ourselves from seeing women as humans. So it's really sort of dehumanizing and objectifying women, not viewing them as individual people. And so like the MRAs, they blame women and feminism for the cause of any issues that they're facing. The only difference is, like I said, they have decided to live without women where possible, which sounds like it might not be a bad thing, but it can be. Next, when we're talking about the manosphere and all of these subcultures, to me, it's really, really important to acknowledge that this closely aligns with alt-right and is particularly influenced by white supremacy. So it's really important to acknowledge that the manosphere is inherently racist. So both the manosphere and white supremacy are rooted in this hierarchical thinking. So for the manosphere, it's often that there's that men have dominance and power over women, and that obviously echoes white supremacy. And it's this idea that like rigid gender and racial hierarchies must be perpetuated, and like the societies must be kept safe from the outsiders. So both these ideologies, they blame marginalized people. So for example, where the manosphere will blame women, then white supremacy will blame people that are not white for their issues. But this coincides a lot of these ideologies, because when you look at particularly incel forums, then some of the incels will talk about the Stacys not wanting them because they're not white enough, or because they're not athletic enough, or because English is not their first language. So there really is this idea that the ultimate is a straight white man. And they really are fixated on that natural order. So while we're going through this and talking about the manosphere, I just want to make it really clear that there is that link there. I'd like to talk about it more, but obviously time again. So now this is a slide that I'd also like to spend a lot of time on, because I think this is one that would be really useful, but there simply isn't the time. But we have, so that was an overview of some of the different subcultures within the manosphere, but how it is sort of leaked out into sort of our everyday society is obviously through the likes of influencers, and not just influencers, politicians, broadcasters, podcasters. Some of these faces you'll be familiar with, some of them maybe not so much. I think I'll make this presentation available afterwards so you can look them up, because I've got notes where it says all their names and what they do and everything. We've got the likes of trad wives, which is a new movement, because I think it's important to acknowledge that actually there are women that have internalized misogyny who are also perpetuating the views of the manosphere in terms of trad wives, and that is a growing trend, especially on the likes of TikTok, Instagram, things like that. It's important to look at. We've got a lot of podcasters here. Obviously, you've got Andrew Tate, and even the likes of Donald Trump. This is someone that we have seen that is now being re-elected into power in America, and that has real life consequences. All of these people on the screen, in their different ways, really, I suppose, are speakers for these ideologies in the manosphere. But I will just sort of briefly just glance over it for now. However, okay, so I can see a couple of these haven't loaded. That's a shame. I'll show you the ones that have. So one of the people that we saw on the previous slide is a podcaster for the Fresh and Fit podcast. This is a podcast that was on the likes of Spotify, but is now mainly accessed on YouTube. This is a huge podcast. There's 1.57 million subscribers on YouTube. They're seen as, or they call themselves, men's #1 podcast. And I don't know if you can read a tweet that was said there, but it's why do women deserve less? Because simps, the government, and society as a whole pedestalizes women for having a vagina. Give them less so they respect you and give you more. Everyone else gives them more so you don't have to. That is just like a tiny snapshot of the kind of things that is said on their podcast, and is accessed by millions of people, particularly young people, particularly young boys. In the middle, we have Nicholas Fuentes, and that is a screenshot from a TikTok that was a video that he posted shortly after Donald Trump was elected. That is a rant about how, yes, we're controlling your body. He is an alt-right politician in America. Politician is maybe the least term. He's someone to definitely look into. And this was a tweet of his that went viral after the elections, which was, "Your body, my choice, forever." Some other ones that you can't see there, but I'll just, I'll read them out because I do have them. So there was a tweet that someone said is, "What are some classy activities that you would teach your daughter?" And someone replied, "Silence." And that person that replied was Sneeko, who is a huge influencer and podcaster. So that's advocating that women should be silent. Again, you'll get the slides and you can see all of these other ones that are maybe not showing, or they're not shown on my screen anyway, but they're just things to look out for. So Vodafone did a study for Safer Internet Day and found that 69% of pre-adolescent boys, so not just teenage boys, but young boys, have already encountered misogynistic content online. Some encounter it within 60 seconds of logging on. So it's freely accessed. These subcultures that we once maybe thought of as the dark web are actually incredibly easy to access, and I'll show you in a second. But I think we have to acknowledge that if we're working with young people, they have probably seen all of this stuff and more. I don't think anyone that's online is immune from seeing it. Like, oh yeah, it says here. So it's impossible to be a young person online and avoid misogyny. And I would say a lot of young people that are accessing this content is unaware that it's harmful. A lot of them won't know what the term manosphere is, or maybe they've heard of incels, but wouldn't necessarily know what is meant by incel culture. And so I'll talk a bit about ways that we can talk to young people about this. So I think but it's really important to acknowledge that this is not necessarily content that people are accessing on purpose in the beginning. It's just it's so prevalent, and when you have the time, I would recommend searching any of these kind of terms that you would maybe imagine young people, young boys in particular, might search for online, particularly on TikTok. TikTok is now used as a search engine more than the likes of Google. So where we might Google something, young people would more than likely just type it into TikTok to get an answer. So if you look up something like how to get a girlfriend, how to be a better man, tips for being more masculine, how to talk to women, how to flirt, anything like that, it will absolutely take no time at all before you're seeing some of these screenshots on the side, really, really harmful content. When I was first looking into this topic for my local community, then I spent a lot of time on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram, and I went into incognito mode, which is making sure that all of your like cookies and your cache isn't influencing what you're being searched for. So it should be like a clean slate. And within 5 minutes, I was getting these really, really harmful videos portraying women as objects, all of these dating coaches using manipulative techniques on how young boys can manipulate women. So I would recommend that maybe you have a go. I would say do put it in a incognito mode so you don't have these things then appearing in your feed again and again, because some of it is quite disturbing. But I think it's best not to shut your eyes to it. I think if you are working with young people, it's important to see what young people are accessing. So speaking of sort of things to watch out for, and again, this is something that I would really, in an ideal world, like to spend a long time on, but hopefully, again, you'll get the slides and you can look up some of these terms yourselves. But these are terms that are prevalent in the manosphere and throughout all of these subcultures, and may indicate that a young person has been influenced by misogynistic content online. If you are not familiar with this kind of stuff, this is not your day-to-day job. This looks like another language. It's really difficult to understand if you're not used to it. But if you can get familiar with some of these terms, it can be really helpful. I'll run through a couple of them. So the likes of like femoids or even females, it's used as a dehumanizing term. So it's portraying women as like less than human. And it's commonly used in a way that portrays like resentment towards women, so sort of othering them. So that's when you get females, femoids, things like that. Chad is a big one that you'll see in the incel community. So it refers to like your typical alpha male, so someone that incels imagine would be really successful with women, and the term is often used sarcastically or resentfully. So if someone's a Chad, then to people that are involved in the incel culture, this is sort of a sarcastic, derogatory term for the men that are successful with women. And then similarly, Stacey is a term used for women that are seen as like hyper feminine, hyper desirable, but again, it's sort of a derogatory term, so it's used to other people, and really, again, to see them as less than human, by not using their real name, things like that. Um, ER is a big one. So if you ever see ER, or if you see in other words just the ER capitalized, that stands for Elliot Rogers, who's one of the people that you saw in an earlier slide that committed mass killings in America, following the publicization of his incel manifesto. So on online communities where inceldom is prevalent, you'll see a lot of people threatening to go ER, which means threatening to go out and commit violence, kill people essentially. So that's one to watch out for. Looks maxing is another one, and I'll talk about that in a second because there's a website that might be useful to know about. But it's the idea that incels may go to extreme lengths to change their appearance in order to attract women. So, for example, on one of the forums, there are discussions on how to exercise your muscles to get a thicker neck, how to make your nose appear more masculine, how to gain muscle. And none of these things are in order to make men and boys be more healthy. It's in order to get into this ideal Chad stereotype to attract women. Alpha is obviously alpha men, beta men. Yeah, I could spend quite a lot of time on this, but I am just conscious of the time. SMV, sexual market value, that is a way of referring to women, again, as seeing them as animals essentially, with a market value rather than as human beings. I will say that if you're not familiar with these terms, it can really feel like, why do I need to know these? This is obviously a bit of nonsense, but these terms are so common online, like they really are. Once you start seeing them in spaces where young people are online, it's really hard not to see them. Finally, I'll do AWOLT. So that's another one. So that's all women are like that. So that's an acronym that's used a lot online, again, as a way to generalize women and say, well, all women are like that. And it really, really builds that resentment and distrust and hatred of women in these online spaces. So speaking of online spaces, okay, again, I don't know if you can see that picture. It's not loading for me, but maybe it's loading for you. So I would say if you are working with young people in any capacity, it's really important to be aware of some of these online spaces, so that you can understand where radicalization might occur. Now, I will say that these are unlikely to be spaces that young people are accessing straight away. But I would say that this is more like once young people have gone down that rabbit hole of, like I said, searching something on TikTok or Instagram or YouTube and watching a few videos, reading comments, it's really, really easy to get sucked into this side of the internet, which is not as secretive as it used to be. The big one to be aware of is incels.is, which is the main like online forum for people that consider themselves incels. On first glance, it seems really friendly. The opening thing says, "Welcome, this is a forum for involuntary celibates, people who lack a significant other. Are you lonely and wish you had someone in your life? You're not alone. Join our forum and talk to people just like you." That sounds really nice. So I went on, and I would encourage you to do the same. Have a look at the forum. You don't need an account to sign up and see everything. One of the threads there below is it's flagged as rage fuel, and it was actually posted yesterday at 9:30, and it says, "Women did this to us. With revenge in mind, women reduced us to level of insects. They will pay for what they've done with punishments worse than death." That was on the front page of this forum. It's so easy to access. The other picture that you can't see, I won't read the whole thing because it's a bit longer, but it says, "Women have never allowed non-attractive men to even exist in their spaces. If any straight sub-5 male dared to venture near the vicinity of a Stacey, he could be expected to be harassed, bullied, or gaslit." So it really is portraying this idea that women are just people to be hated. So as well as that website, which I would recommend, there's also looksmax.org, which is another website that, again, like it initially portrays itself to be quite health focused, and you think, well, that might be quite good for young people, young men and boys in particular, but it really is all about getting that ideal masculine look to be able to dominate women. And it's actually really unhealthy. They talk a lot about ways to bulk up to unhealthy levels very, very quickly in order to be able to overpower women. There's the likes of 4chan, Discord, and I should say with the likes of Discord itself is not a bad website. If the young people that you're accessing are on Discord, that's not a bad thing. Discord is just sort of an online platform that can be very, very private and host online communities. So, for example, if people are sharing more extreme views in some of these more public websites, they might move on to Discord, where things are a lot more private and a lot more dangerous. That's where real radicalization may occur. We have loads of Reddit subreddits I would recommend checking out. When I was doing research for this, I actually contacted some users that were on these sites. Actually, there's one that's not there that's like called the X incels or X red pill as well, where it's actually there's a community of people that were previously considering themselves incels that have decided to try and change. And so I actually reached out to them to help with this presentation. So in a second, you'll see some of the answers that they helped me with. But yeah, these are some platforms I'd recommend checking out. So what we're seeing offline, so I suppose the reason why I was asked to create this sort of awareness session in Shetland is because we were seeing just a significant rise in our local teachers and youth workers witnessing incidences of low-level misogynistic behaviours, jokes, antagonistic rhetoric, that kind of like that back in the kitchen type jokes that like maybe 5-10 years ago it kind of felt like we were moving away from. It kind of felt like we were becoming a more inclusive and more equal society, but things have gone right downhill again, and we're seeing that kind of on the ground. There's some stats there, like 38% of Gen Z and millennials thinks efforts to advance women's rights have gone far enough. And 43% think that society has gone so far in promoting women's rights that we're discriminating against men. And then 2/5 of young men think that women often claim that they've been raped when they regret having sex. So these are some of like the actual real life views that we're seeing that have sort of started in these online communities and are in the real world. So effects on young people. Again, like I would say a lot of this is probably common knowledge, but there's obviously increased feelings of uncertainty and fear online. That is both for young men and boys accessing spaces online and for women and girls that are often the targets of this rhetoric. There's the reinforcement of harmful gender stereotypes and this toxic masculinity, and I'll talk about that in a second. A normalization of violence against women and girls, how it's not even seen as a taboo subject as such in some of these communities anymore. Young men showing entitlement towards women's bodies. We're seeing increased aggression and hostility towards women and girls. We're also seeing young boys struggling with emotional regulation and increased anger and frustration, and this increased feeling of loneliness, which actually like we can all relate to, and that can often be what has driven these young people to look for a community online. Another one that's really important is stigma around victimhood and the fact that some of these online perpetrators are so idolized, the likes of Andrew Tate, the likes of some of these podcasters, that real victims are think there's no point in reporting. And obviously increased incidences of violence in young people's relationships. Again, I'm just noticing the time, so I'm whizzing through, but hopefully we can catch up. This is something that I am sure you will all be aware of. This is a version of the Allport scale of gender-based violence, or the pyramid of violence, as some people call it. And I will talk about in a second how we can use this with young people, but it really is just emphasizing that the behaviors at the top of the pyramid, murder, rape, physical violence, molestation, most people in society understand that these behaviors are wrong. Most people think if I saw it, I would call it out, I would do something about it. But we know that these behaviors at the top of the pyramid just don't exist without the fundamentals at the bottom of the pyramid. And all of the bottom of the pyramid, it's so rife online. It's really, really bad in some of these online communities, to the point that it's filtering out into the real world. These are obviously some quotes of what we'll see both online and then parroted in person. So really, when we're looking at young people and their access to online misogyny, we really, really want to catch it while it's at these bottom layers of the pyramid before it moves up. But as you can see, it has become normalized. So I guess what can we do about it? So the manosphere and this world of online misogyny, it relies on creating echo chambers of peers where harmful beliefs are normalized and reinforces. I will say, having dipped my toe into some of these communities, there is a real sense of belonging. There is a real sense of community, which is quite disturbing. So once young people have involved themselves in the community in some way, and that can start with just watching a couple of videos or liking a couple of comments, it's really, really hard to get out of it, because if you're told that the whole world is against you and that you're not to blame for anything that's going wrong in your life, that can probably feel really good. And that is how people get sucked in. So we really need to offer our young people a better alternative. So who is likely to be at risk? So obviously, any young person is at risk of being exposed to online misogyny. Any of us are at risk. Like I said, just spend 5 minutes searching any of these terms, looking up. It's so clear. However, there are certain factors that can make people a bit more vulnerable to radicalization, so taking steps further into these communities. So we've got things like low self-esteem, social isolation and loneliness, rejection by peers or difficulties fitting in, so maybe particularly at school or in youth work settings, perhaps difficulties understanding norms and social cues, and peer pressure to conform to group norms. So this idea of, well, if your group of friends are sharing these videos, there's that peer pressure to fit in. Also a recent family or community estrangement and that feeling disconnected. So that feeling like a lack of community, a lack of support, can lead people to finding it online. A recent emotional pain or trauma, again, that links to this idea of like, it feels really nice if there's someone else to blame. Uh, and a desensitization to violence and misogynic rhetoric. So again, I guess it's like a full circle where the more these things become normalized, the more people are desensitized and the easier it is to get radicalized. Lack of positive role models is a huge one. Absence of just open conversations about gender and relationships. People that find it difficult to understand consequences or lack empathy. So I had a conversation with a Reddit user that was part of the incel community, and he said that, which sounds a bit silly to me, I don't know, but that he was just never taught empathy, or he never really realized that the views that he held had real implications on real people. Like he sort of just didn't connect the dots that the women that he was talking about were real and had feelings. Um, and this idea that people just believing things online. So people that have limited media literacy or just the ability to think critically are much more likely to get radicalized. So, how to spot the signs? Again, I'm really rushing through this. Sorry, Samantha. So things to be aware of that I'm teaching the local caregivers in my community is if you're seeing young people that are constantly online and are, which everyone is, let's be honest, but are secretive about that online use. That's a really big thing, is that element of secretivity, that kind of that hiding what you're accessing online. Using new language and slang, and that's where those key terms are going to be really useful to know about, is you see them. And of course, some people could be parroting them or saying them ironically without realizing what they're saying. But that again normalizes it and desensitizes violence against women and girls, and again makes it more easier to be radicalized. If you notice a sudden disrespectful attitude towards women, particularly refusing to listen to teachers or parents or caregivers who are women, I've even noticed this when I go into schools and do my presentations on domestic abuse and relationships for young people. There are certain young people in the classroom that I think have a lack of respect because I'm a woman. Increased levels of anger and frustration. A huge one is anyone that has this us versus them mentality, like this kind of like the othering of women or everyone's against me, that kind of thing. Another big one is arguing as if they're reading from a script. So quite often in these online forums, there will be certain like answers to why are men always accused of rape, or why do men not have access to their children in family courts? And there's like a very sort of set script that like men's rights activists that are very intellectual will say that young men and boys will parrot. So if young people are, it's seeming like they're reading from a script and are not deviating from those viewpoints, that could be a sign. Blaming women and girls. Again, that strong victim mentality, a change in appearance, going back to that idea of wanting to change your looks, questioning your identity, your faith, your previously held beliefs. That kind of links back into a lack of community, and again, being socially isolated. Or if someone has an increased number of friends that would usually be online, again, linked to that kind of secretive of how did you meet these friends? How do you know them? That would be signs to watch out for as well. Again, I'd like to go into this in more detail, but I can give more information after. So what can we do? I think the main thing is starting a conversation, and it's really important to ask open-ended questions. And this is really, really hard, especially when it's the likes of, I spoke to a young person that loved Andrew Tate. It's really, really hard not to just shut them down and say, like, what are you talking about? He's a whatever. it's important to approach the topic with curiosity and actually try and listen to understand, and address the root causes. So the chances are that most young people have fallen into this sort of online sphere because they're lonely, because they feel rejected, or because they feel insecure. And if we can tackle those root causes, then maybe we can help, especially young men and boys, before they go further into this. It's really important to teach media literacy. So talking about algorithms and how if you keep accessing the same content, you're going to keep accessing the same content, you're going to be fed the same things. And the idea of echo chambers, how if you're surrounding yourself with people who agree with you, you're not being exposed to other people's worldviews. It's really important to provide alternative role models. I'd love to spend some time talking about some good ones because there are a lot. And highlighting low-level misogyny, so using that Allport scale, that pyramid, and actually, where possible, explaining to young people. I know what you said is as a joke, but here's why it can kind of contribute to more violence, and encourage positive activities. So again, like a lot of people that get radicalized, it's because they're feeling rejected, they're feeling lonely, they're feeling isolated from society, and if we can help them find opportunities to socialize with other people. In real life, I think a lot of people are scared to say online. Online is fine. Like I like there are some really healthy online communities. It's just really, really important that you have an open relationship with that young person and they're not being secretive about it. Like there's nothing wrong with someone gaming if they're really struggling with like in-person social skills, but it's just about being careful about what they're accessing and making sure that it's something that's enjoying and fulfilling. Um, Again, quickly, oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, what not to do? Don't start an argument, and especially don't overly criticize their idols, which I find really hard. Don't restrict online access. It's really, really easy to say, right, you're not allowed on this, you're not allowed on that. The chances are if young people want to access these spaces, they'll find a way to. So by shutting the conversation down completely, then they're more likely to hide things from you. So I think it's better to be open. And don't condemn the young person or make them feel guilty because, like I said, more often than not, young people will be stumbling upon this without realizing at first. Don't generalize or label because that will fuel the us versus them. And another one is don't focus exclusively on women's issues, which is hard if you're working in violence against women and girls and you know that the majority of people that experience gender-based violence are women and girls. However, that's not always going to be helpful to say in this context. So sometimes it's better to emphasize equality for all genders to show that young men are listened to. Finally, some conversation prompts. Again, just some examples about open-ended questions. What do you like about the content you're seeing? How do these conversations make you feel about yourself and other people? Or men's mental health is really important. Do you think the advice that they're giving is helpful or harmful in addressing these struggles? Just kind of open-ended questions that are really not criticizing and seeking to understand. Again, I would talk about this more, but that is me. Thank you so much for listening. I'm so sorry I've rattled on. I feel like I've tried to cram everything in, but thank you for listening.
Brilliant. And thank you for making space on the agenda for me today, and thanks for sharing the slides. And I should say in advance, I've kind of squinted to see if there's people on the call I recognise. I'm sure there is. So good to see folk that I've met with before, and if I've not met you before, then it's nice to speak to you. But I'll be squinting because I had a contact lens fall out just before the presentation, so I'm doing my best to see what I'm doing, but I think I'll get there. So as as has just been said, I work in the Violence Against Women and Girls team in the justice part of Scottish Government. My primary focus is commercial sexual exploitation. So inevitably that led me into sort of becoming more involved in the kind of online VAWG side of policy, and I'm kind of looking at it with the CSC focus, but of course looking at VAWG more broadly online as well. So the presentation today will kind of cover both elements in the kind of time that we've got. So if we kind of move on to the next slide, I wanted to start off with some information about some of the work that we've done with the Open University. I'm sure many of you on the call are aware that the Open University did a report across the 4 nations, which was published earlier in the year. They did a kind of launch in Edinburgh that the minister came along to, which was really helpful, because I think that highlighted some of the kind of key issues that we need to be thinking about going forward in terms of improving the support for women and girls online. One of the really good things to know about the Open University, which again I'm sure many of you know already, is that they opened a research centre that specifically is looking at tackling online VAWG, and so we're continuing that relationship with them as we both move forward, so that their research that they're doing in this space can kind of take into account some of the things that we're looking to do in Scotland as well. So that's a really helpful relationship I think we've got as we move forward with our work. So that research shows, and again with the slides that afterwards you'll get all the links to the things that I'm talking about, but that particular piece of research showed that 3 out of 4 women in Scotland that reported incidents relating to online VAWG were not satisfied with the outcome of what happened. Many weren't confident that they knew about their online rights online. They weren't clear on what the online safety bill, now it's an app, but at that time what that actually was. And equally there being a kind of level of unsureness about what had happened. Was it online VAWG? Was it legal? Was it not legal? So I think what came out of that survey was really helpful in terms of highlighting the need for clear, consistent information for women and girls online. And I think some of those quotes that I lifted kind of illustrate that point as well, with one person kind of highlighting that they didn't feel that there was any point reporting it, that they felt just like a statistic, and another person feeling like there was a degree of normalization in terms of what people were experiencing as well. And if we move over to the next slide, that kind of shows some of the diversity of experiences that people are having online. I think when we're looking at all the terminology used there as well, I'll come on to that in a few slides time, but that just goes to show, and I think the earlier presentation touched on this as well, the need to keep pace with the change in terms being used online as well. And again, that's another reason why keeping young people and children at the centre of our work as well is super important, because clearly it's a very evolving space. I think with the terminology point as well, it links back to that earlier point in the first slide about people being clear about what they've experienced and is it legal, is it illegal. And I think sextortion is a kind of fine example of that, because there's lots of, when we were developing the campaign with Fearless Crime Stoppers and Police Scotland, there were so many different terms actually in that space, and that's just one example of where I think getting consistent terms for what we're talking about online is really helpful if we want people to be able to report what's happened and access the support they need. So if we move on to the next slide, that really focuses on the importance of keeping young people at the centre. And actually just before this call, I got an email from Ofcom, which was really well timed actually, because they've published their online nation report that they do. I think it's an annual report, and that showed that I think was 18 to 24-year-olds on average spend 6 hours and 1 minute online a day. So that's a fair amount of the day that's being spent in the online sphere. So I think that's why, another reason why it's so important that when we're thinking about whether it's within our own lives, I'm a parent, or in our professional work, or whether it's even just from a perspective of developing policy, that we're thinking about children's well-being in the offline and the online world. So for example, when we're developing surveys and things like that, if we're asking questions, are we asking that question to capture the holistic experience of young people, to capture those experiences that are happening online as well? And clearly the online and offline they merge into each other, don't they? And within that report, actually, the Ofcom one, it suggested that girls aged 13 to 17, 60% of them had experienced misogyny or kind of come into contact with misogynistic material online as well. So once I've finished, I'll drop the link to that report in the chat. Haven't had time to read through it all today, but clearly there was a lot of useful stuff in that to have a look at. The Girl Guiding survey, another annual one, came out last month. I'm sure some of you have already seen that. And I think that indicates some of the things that we really need to be thinking about. So I think what was concerning there was one of the things about pressures to share images of themselves and not being comfortable with that. And this was girls aged 11 to 21 in this cohort. And equally, the concerns around people pretending to be someone that they're not online. In terms of what would help them feel safer online, again, I think it kind of goes back to that first slide. 48% saying that they wanted to feel that reports and concerns were being taken seriously. Feeling that privacy settings needed to be easier to understand and change, 39%. And I think probably many of us on the call have probably grappled to get to grips with tech at many times in terms of things like that. So I think that's one that we could probably all understand. And the final one about 28% feeling that they needed more guidance on how to report concerns where they'd had difficult experiences online. And I think the kind of following presentation that the Civic Digits will do will be really helpful as well in terms of explaining the support that we give to young boys and young men in this space as well, because clearly in terms of perpetrators, and this is again coming back to sextortion, a commonality there is that for girls and boys, perpetrators commonly are going to be men, and equally safe obviously recognises the kind of experiences and impact that VAWG has on both boys and girls. So moving on, that's a good segue into delivering equally safe. So the refreshed equally safe strategy published I think it was towards the end of last year. I think this year has gone by in such a whiz. I'm finding it difficult to keep track of which years I'm talking about. But the most recent Equally Safe strategy update drew importance to recognising that point about thinking about our lives online and offline, the interlinking between those experiences. And some of the Delivering Equally Safe funded projects have a clear focus on supporting women and girls online. So of course there's the work that Southwest Grid for Learning and the Revenge Porn Helpline do in that space. In Aberdeen, they've got Cyber Safe Scotland, who I think got a mention in the UK Parliament this week for their report, that their impact report that they're published, which I think drew attention to the importance of having children and young people in terms of at the centre when you're designing materials and things like that. Of course, they're not the only two projects within the DES Fund that will be involved in supporting young women and girls online, but they're just two examples. And I think that's why events like this are really important, because it gives everybody a chance to actually hear more about what people are doing across the piece. Within the Equally Safe Delivery Plan, which was published earlier this year, there is an action around making sure that we improve support for stakeholders in terms of how they're supporting women who've experienced online VAWG, and making sure that they've got access to up-to-date information resources, and potentially maybe a network of support, a bit like what we're doing today, but in a kind of more formal and regular setting. So we've been working with the More Collective. I'm sure many of you in the call have come across the More Collective before, but their work is very much rooted in digital inclusion. And the More Collective kindly helped us run some workshop sessions with stakeholders to understand from them, and some of you on the call might have been involved in this, but to understand from them or yourselves what would be helpful in terms of making sure that there is that support for practitioners when they're working with women who've experienced online VAWG. And what came out of those discussions were the importance of having reliable and trusted advice that people can go to, that they know is up to date as well, given the pace of change in this space, but equally a network, a forum that they could come together to discuss updates, training in this space, share resources. So that is something that we're taking forward with the more collective. We'll be hoping to move forward with that in January, about bringing back those people that were involved in the original workshops to discuss what such a kind of future network could look like. Obviously, if there's people on the call that weren't part of that initial network that want to be involved in that network as we move forward, then if you get in touch with me after today, I can make sure that we loop you in to that piece of work as well. So moving on to the next slide. Thank you. So we've got the internal side facing side of things that we're doing as well. So across Scottish Government, it isn't solely the Violence Against Women and Girls team in Justice and the Equality Unit that are looking at how we address online VAWG. There's a whole range of different teams across Scottish Government that clearly have interests. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to make sure that we had a kind of consistent approach that was aligning across all the different pieces of work. And so we decided to create an internal policy forum that will meet on a regular basis to discuss what we're doing to improve online safety for women and girls. We've met on 2 occasions so far, so it's still early days, but the plan will be for that group to have some interconnection between that external network that I've just spoken about now. And some examples of the policy areas that we've included in that forum are they probably feel quite obvious ones to mention, but child protection, education, so thinking about school and higher education, organised crime as well, commercial sexual exploitation, and looking at digital inclusion and cyber resilience as well. And the list is much broader than that, but that's just some kind of examples there. We've got our justice analytical colleagues looped into that work as well. And one of the really helpful early things that they've done, and despite the fact we've only met twice, we've already with the help of the analysts been able to develop a definitions piece of work which kind of sets out some of the definitions in the online VAWG space. Now clearly that will be an evolving piece of work, I think, but that piece of work in the early stages of this forum that we've got internally is really helpful, because I think that helps us have consistency across policy areas in terms of what we're talking about. So when we're talking about sextortion, that we are all using the same language, because as I said earlier, I think that then becomes really important for victims and those supporting victims when we're producing materials, guidance in government. If we're all using consistent terminology, it just becomes easier for people utilising that advice to navigate it if we are using consistent terms. The other piece of work that links into this on the broader level is we have a 5 jurisdictions group with civil servants in the other governments, so Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Wales, and UK government as well. So we meet on a fairly regular basis. I think we've got another meeting coming up in the new year, and that discusses what's happening in violence against women and girls across all the different governments. But online VAWG is one of the kind of key areas that the group has an interest in. So we've kind of got, as part of our work on online VAWG, we've got our kind of local Scottish government, what's happening across all the different departments. We'll have that external one that plugs into that, and then as a kind of overarching thing, we've got that kind of wider what's happening across the kind of UK and Ireland as well. So I think a very kind of joined up approach to this, and clearly on online, the different parts of the UK and beyond need to be speaking to each other, because obviously online doesn't kind of respect borders. It kind of travels widely, doesn't it? So that ties actually neatly into the next slide on commercial sexual exploitation. So as I said earlier, my primary focus in my work is commercial sexual exploitation, and that's kind of what pulled me into the kind of online VAWG work in the first place. But I think CSE is a good example to consider when we're thinking about the groups of women and girls online that have additional risks that they face. So clearly taking an intersectional approach to thinking about how we protect women and girls online. And I think when we think about those involved in commercial sexual exploitation, particularly where it's online, there's a whole range of additional risks that they might face. I'm sure many of you've heard of the kind of web kind of spaces where men that have purchased sex will kind of, it sounds awful to say it, but reviews, for want of a better word, there'll be sort of a lot of misogynistic content in some of those spaces, but equally there'll be the kind of risks of intimate image abuse, and then the kind of control that people can exert when they've got images. So the cross-party group on commercial sexual exploitation in the Scottish Parliament did a report a few years ago on online pimping, and that highlighted the fact that in addition to the kind of issues that someone faced where they had been advertised online on adult services websites, that there was the ongoing issue of the fact that if somebody was looking at their exit and recovery, having control over that image, getting that image taken down, but equally the concerns about who had access to those images, and maybe the people that would be controlling those individuals, using those images as a kind of ongoing kind of coercive mechanism to keep controlling that person. So yeah, clearly commercial sexual exploitation is an area that we need to be thinking about within our kind of wider online VAWG response. And we've got some work that we've just started with Police Scotland in terms of the work that we're moving forward on in terms of how we tackle commercial sexual exploitation more generally. And there's not time to get into all of that, but one of the key areas within that package of work with Police Scotland that we've got is looking to understand and better evidence the kind of presence of online commercial sexual exploitation in Scotland, and to get more understanding around that. And we've specifically funded Police Scotland to build the kind of evidence base in that space, funding software to kind of aid them with that. The next kind of slide, as we kind of head towards the kind of end of the presentation, I wanted to just flag Safer Internet Day and Cyber Scotland Week. February 2025 and March 25 seems like ages away, but we're probably galloping towards it. So many of you on the call might know already, but Safer Internet Day generally will have a theme, and the theme this year is Too Good to Be True, protecting yourself and others from scams online. That's probably quite timely given the fact that in Scottish Government with Crime Stoppers, as I said earlier, Fearless, with recently had the kind of sextortion public awareness campaign. There'll be a second phase to that awareness campaign actually around February time, so that will connect quite well into the kind of wider Safer Internet Day work. But the reason that I'm kind of flagging that is because there'll be a link into the presentation that you can click on, but that gives you information about how within your own work that you can become involved in Safer Internet Day. That there'll be a page where you can access resources and information on that. I've included the contact for Safer Internet Day in the slides as well, so if you wanted to reach out to Jess, whose contact details are there, she can give you more information about how to become involved in the day. But I was at an event, I think it was last week, it might have been the week before last, but the weeks are flying by now, but it was an event that was all around the planning for Safer Internet Day, and they showed us some of the resources that they've developed for children and young people around this, and it was covering a kind of a wide a really quite wide age range from primary right through to senior level. So again, I think there'll be some really helpful resources that come out of that. Equally, Cyber Scotland week is the 24th of February through to the 2nd of March, and they've got a similar kind of theme about sort of, I guess, cyber resilience, keeping safe online. So I think on either of either of the events, if anybody on the call has got particular events or pieces of work that they're planning, let us know, because from a Scottish Government perspective, we're trying to better coordinate our efforts across both events to kind of maximise the impact as much as possible. I suppose similar to what we're actually doing with 16 days of action, so really making the most of these two events in a kind of similar sort of way. Even though those the day and the kind of cyber week itself have those kind of specific focuses, I think it also provides an opportunity to highlight any kind of resources or materials that you've already got to kind of support women, girls, young people, children with online safety more broadly than that as well. The kind of final page was just again probably more helpful when you get the slides, but these were just some sort of Scottish Government web pages that we've got, which look to specifically help people with online safety, which might be useful for your work and the people that you're supporting. So Parent Club is a resource that supports parents with toddlers right through to teens, and that's got online safety advice that kind of goes through the ages, if that makes sense. It could be a helpful resource for you. Equally, our Safer Scot pages have a kind of range of different pages on violence against women and girls. They've got a page on intimate image abuse, for example. But as part of the kind of work we did with Fearless Crime Stoppers on the sextortion campaign, we also added a page on sextortion there as well. And then finally, Education Scotland of course has resources in this space as well for people working with children in schools or educational environments as well. So I hope that gallop through has been helpful. Like I say, once you've got the slides, if you want to get in touch with me about the kind of Safer Day or Cyber Week or the kind of work that we're doing more collective, or just anything else in the presentation that has piqued your interest, then get in touch with me, and I'm happy to have a chat. But thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, my name's Clare Duffy. I'm the director of Civic Digits, and Civic Digits exists in order to we make technology in order to tell stories about technology. Our first sort of primary focus is young people, but the work that we make really is for young people and their communities, their families. So it's for everybody, and I guess kind of the overarching thing is about trying to create spaces where people can listen to each other. And yeah, I think that's kind of essentially what it is. I'm going to put actually in the chat a link to, oh, that's not my website that I'm linking to. I'll find the link while the video's playing. So we made a project called Many Good Men. It started life during lockdown, and we shared it as a full production at Hearts Football Ground in February this year. And we're just back from doing the same process in a week in Romania, which we were also able to share with Scottish participants. So perhaps, Samantha, if you can share, we've got a 3-minute video, which hopefully does quite a good job of showing what the project is. And then I'm really happy to talk about it, but I'm aware that time is getting short in this session. So I'm also happy to take questions if that's a more helpful way to go ahead. Yeah, if you want to play the video, that'd be great.
We interrupt our usual broadcast to bring breaking news. A gunman in Edinburgh has shot dead 5 women and a man in JD Sports near Princes Street. We're going immediately to our reporter, Jenny Mackle, who is on Princes Street. Jenny, what can you tell us about the gunman and why he did this?
Many Good Men is all about 2 young football players who witness an incel shooting in their hometown. Now, they don't know anything about incels when this happens. They're really shocked, traumatized by the event. And so they decide to create an online campaign called Many Good Men to stand up against incels. They're warned that they don't really know anything about incel culture, and so they create fake IDs and they start to research incels and the manosphere.
You're a jerk, you're whatever. That's what women want, right?
Modern women don't like men who commit them.
because they are vulnerable in different ways. They get triggered by some of the things that they find online, and one of them ends up really kind of spiraling down that rabbit hole of the misogynistic content that you can find online, and that is targeted at young men, and he ends up destroying the most important relationships in his life with his mother and his sister. What's really important about this project is that we create the space at the end to ask the audience to become active participants in the character stories. So they are given the opportunity to make an intervention, to wind the story back and say, hang on, stop. How about if we create a character here who could come in and make a difference to this character's life? We worked with groups of young people making this show, and that's really, really important because it's the voices of young people that come out through this show. It's their experiences that are being represented, and they were really, really clear that football is at the heart of how men, and maybe particularly young men, get their cues about what it means to be a man and how masculinity is represented and the kind of status it has, the meaning that masculinity has. We want this show to be available to young people all across Scotland, and we're really excited about remaking the show with other young people too, both in the UK and abroad. We're currently about to make this show again in Romania. Please get in touch if you'd like to find out more about Many Good Men again. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So, Many Good Men uses arts-based practice to engage young people about online gender-based violence. And I can talk a little bit maybe about the process, about how we made it, and then it would be great if people want to ask me questions. As I said, Many Good Men started in lockdown when I was approached by Katie Brown from COSLA and Linda Thompson from the Women's Support Project, and some others, and we were talking about how there were more young women joining the sex industry online during lockdown, and over a series of long and quite intense conversations, we thought, well, why is it that we would make something for young women to protect themselves when really the cause of this problem is the perpetrators being men, and what the ideas about masculinity are that are causing this. And that coincided with me reading Laura Bates's book, Men Who Hate Women. And so sort of a combination of those two things meant that I started to put together an arts-based practice project. It started at in Glasgow University, in Glasgow, with a group of young men, and we were asking them about where they got their cues from about what it meant to be a man, and they said very clearly that it was football. It's interesting because I've just done that project in Romania. In Romania, they situated their story in trap music, which is a form of rap, popular music, and also the church. So different communities, different cultures are going to have different ways that they locate that sort of like, I suppose, sort of everyday misogyny that builds towards sort of allowing people to be more vulnerable to radicalisation. So when we got enough money together to do the Many Good Men project, we created two groups, a group of young men and a group of young women. And we kind of started to explore what it meant, what the manosphere was, what their experiences were of gender-based violence online. And we started to create characters who could be vulnerable to radicalisation online, the radicalisation of their masculinity online. And I suppose like the key things that those young people brought up, and which we talked about in quite a lot of depth, were the influence of pornography on young people, how prevalent it is, how much particularly the young women saw the effects of the pornography that was being consumed by the young men in their classes, in their social groups. We talked about how online misogyny sort of spilt into everyday life in different, maybe some small, but some actually really extreme ways, but that it was hard to sort of call out or name because it felt like it was so normalized. So we did a lot of work using drama techniques, talking about how do you challenge somebody about the word bitch, for example, if that's kind of like a beginning of misogyny, when it's or the word pussy, because it's become so normalized. And we also thought quite deeply about the characters' history and background, what their family groups look like, what their local communities look like, and how they would influence their vulnerability to being radicalized. And both the groups of young men and young women very interestingly brought up domestic violence as a key element, which meant that those young men, the fictional young men that they were creating, were particularly vulnerable. So all of that together, coupled with a story which I'll explain in a second, a story which pushes the characters into a place of loneliness and isolation, means that they are very vulnerable to radicalization. So the process of making that, I should say, we thought very carefully about the safeguarding of the young people when we were working with them. Some key things there were that we had a safeguarding committee that we worked with quite carefully to create a risk assessment, which we implemented really rigorously. One of the key things about that risk assessment was about, if you're going to ask young people to research this kind of content online, how do you protect them? So the way that we did that was that we gave the young people phones, so they were completely new email addresses, which they didn't create. We created those email addresses for them. We gave them, essentially a clean online presence. And we also, and I suppose part of that, rather than just sort of clicking the incognito, is that it felt very clear to me from the research that I did that the algorithm, that if you type in, for example, how to get a girlfriend into YouTube, you'll get some relatively benign information about taking showers and exercising and holding doors open for women. But if you keep on looking at such content, if you keep on asking questions around this area, it becomes more and more violent, it becomes more and more extreme, because that's the way that the algorithm works. So that was part of the work that we were doing, was trying to kind of understand, using critical thinking about how the actual system of the internet works, so that your content consumption leads to further types of content consumption. I think that was the key thing. And the other key thing about the safeguarding was that those groups of young people were already groups of young people who were in different organisations, which we were working in partnership with. So when the project finished, those young people were absolutely held still by that organisation, whether it was a school or a youth group. So, the adults that were running those organisations either took part in the sessions that we were doing, or we would talk about it and kind of keep up to date with them about the work that we were doing. So they were really understanding what it was that the young people were doing. So those were the two key, I think, parts of the safeguarding, which was really important. As you saw in the video, the story of Many Good Men is, the idea is that we tell a story where two young men, footballers in this case, witness an incel shooting and don't know anything about incels, which certainly reflects the experience for me of working with lots of young people in this area. They don't know these terms necessarily of incel, and they don't know the term manosphere. They might be coming across content that's very much connected to it, but it's not seen in that way. So these characters start off quite innocent about the manosphere, but they are also traumatized. Like, they have an immediate trauma because they were present at such a violent incident. And so they decide that they want to set up a campaign to take down the losers of these incels. But as they start to research that content, they begin to get radicalized by it because of those underlying vulnerabilities that we worked on in terms of creating those fictional characters. And the whole point of this was that we would take these characters to a point of destruction, to the worst possible outcome, so that the audience then could rewrite that story, and as a community could discuss, agree that this is a real problem, that is something that they understand and see in their own lives, and then say, well, what if we could talk to those characters, or what if we could make some kind of intervention or create another character who could come into that story and make a difference. It's not going to, so that was like the shape of it, was that we create the whole story in order to have that conversation. That conversation is the most important part, where we can really listen to each other and try to explore different possible ways of tackling the problem and the issue. So yeah, I suppose the only thing to say is that one performance is not going to change everybody's lives. The experience of the young people who took part in it, I think, was really profound, and they will probably in lots of different ways go on to be advocates for critical thinking about online misogyny, and I know that they are, so that's great. For young people who took part in the performance, the feedback is very much that it's a good beginning of a conversation, because I suppose, much as Ashlea was saying in her presentation, it really aims to meet young people where they are. It doesn't talk about any of this being like, rather than tackling the problem head on, but by entering the problem through a fictional route, we can kind of imagine what the greater consequences of some things like Andrew Tate could be, without attacking Andrew Tate himself. Because if somebody's already very much, admiring Andrew Tate as a motivational speaker and as a representation of positive masculinity, there's very little that you can do to shift that if you tackle it head on. But if you step to the side and a fictional space, you can think about somebody else who might be adversely affected by that kind of messaging, and explore those ideas in a way that protects those young people who actually might already be somewhat down that line of admiring or thinking that it's really good, this kind of messaging, or that feminism has gone too far. Rather than tackling that head on, using creativity to imagine what a bad consequence could be, is we found a really successful way of dealing with it. I'm really open to questions. I think that's probably as much as I should say for the time being.